What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest? Where is purgatory in the Bible?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. And if that is you, if you are a non-Catholic, maybe you were an active Catholic years ago, maybe you've never been a Catholic, but in any event, you've got a question or two about the Catholic faith, you're looking to get an answer for those questions, do give us a call. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Those of you watching us on TV today, you can participate as well. Our email address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer, Matt Kabinski, our phone screener, Jeff Burson handles social media for us, and I am Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, so good to see you.
Good to see you, my friend. How was your weekend?
It was very nice, thank you. How was yours?
Couldn't be better. Well, actually, I was working on taxes,
so
it could have been better. We're going to lead off with a very interesting objection that we received from Kelly watching us on YouTube. Kelly had this to say. On a recent show, you spoke of narcissism. Wouldn't you say that the Church's political positions, such as opposition to abortion, are narcissistic?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure I even understand the question. I mean, I understand the words in the question, but I don't see how you could construe a position in moral theology that calls on people to respect the inherent dignity of every other human life as narcissistic. I'm failing to see the connection here.
It is a little baffling. Maybe rather than narcissistic, maybe they're saying, kind of an arrogance, or we know what's right.
Sure, I could imagine someone taking this position, saying, like, if you have a moral or theological conviction, you should keep that to yourself, and you shouldn't seek to legislate that universally on society, right? I could see someone taking that point of view.
Okay.
Problem is that, like, to take that stance is to violate your own principle because you just did it.
Well, yeah.
Right. I mean, we can't avoid making moral choices, and if we're going to live well together as people, we have to have principles that we can all agree to and that may instantiate in the form of legislation. Right. Now, you depending on how much pluralism there is in a society and how much diversity, the common ground that we have might shrink to virtually nothing. We might only be able to agree on the contours of a political process, right? But then that leaves you with no basis for actually legislating, right? Any kind of legislation proceeds from some conception of the human good. Now, the Catholic position begins with begins with the conviction of human dignity, that whatever we do in society, it ought to benefit everyone, and we should privilege, in fact, we should have a sort of preferential option for those who cannot help themselves. Now, if you may not agree with that. You may think, might makes right, and I'm for the Übermensch, and let's stomp on other people. I mean, that might be your political philosophy. That's not the political philosophy that the Catholic Church begins from, but with this preferential option for the weakest among us. Now, if you look at society and who are the weakest among us? Clearly the unborn.
Of course. Got to be. All right, and Kelly, thank you so much for your question. Here's one now from Ludiana, who's checking in on YouTube from Kingston, Jamaica. Ludiana says, my question is, how do I explain to my Protestant friends our belief in parousia and not the rapture?
Sure, easily. So the parousia, or parousia, Greek word just refers to the second coming of Jesus. Well, the biblical teaching is that Christ will in fact come again. And that's the Catholic confession. We believe that Christ will come again at the end of time. that will include, St. Paul's Thessalonian correspondence makes clear, our being caught up into the air with the Lord when he returns, and having our bodies translated from these bodies of flesh into spiritual bodies that will not be subject to death and will be with the Lord and like him forever. So that's the Catholic belief. That's not what Protestants mean when they talk about the rapture. They have many other beliefs beyond that that get tied in. For example, most people who believe in the rapture also believe that at the end of time or towards the end of time, that the nation state of Israel will actually rebuild a Jewish temple in Jerusalem and reinstitute temple sacrifices. That's part and parcel of the whole worldview of the rapture. Dispensationalism believes in a restored Jewish temple and Jewish sacrifices. Catholic Church does not believe that that is in any way necessary for the fulfillment of God's purposes. I mean, it's not intrinsic to the nature of redemption, I should put it that way, that Jews offer sacrifice in a temple in Jerusalem, and when Christ comes back, it will certainly not be to reinstitute temple sacrifices. But that is exactly what dispensationalists believe. They think that Jesus will rule for 1,000 years on a physical throne in Jerusalem, and they'll sacrifice goats and bulls as they did under the Old Covenant. So we don't think that. Don't think the New Testament teaches that. Another thing that dispensationalists, rapture people believe, is that Jesus will come 3 times, not just twice. The Catholic Church, along with sacred scripture, teaches that Christ comes first in the incarnation and then a second time at the end of time. The dispensationalists add another coming. They add a secret coming someplace towards the end where Christ yanks all the quote-unquote true believers out of space and time. He sort of pulls them out of the picture and then unleashes a whole series of tribulations, at the end of which time Jesus comes back with his raptured church, and they set up this Hebraic kingdom in Jerusalem. So there's a whole apparatus there that's really derived ultimately from a kind of wooden fundamentalist reading of the Old Testament that assumes that every word in the Old Testament has to be literally fulfilled, not just spiritually fulfilled in the church.
And this is a fairly recent phenomenon.
19th century, yeah. Dispensationalism is a 19th century invention. So even early Protestants didn't know anything about this rapture business.
Okay, well, there you go. And Ludiana, we hope that is helpful for you. Thanks for watching us today on YouTube in Kingston, Jamaica. Got to visit Kingston, Jamaica to do a little missionary work a few years ago, working with the Missions of the Poor, Missionaries of the Poor. You remember them?
I know that y'all been down there.
Father Richard Ho Lung. Fantastic.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Beautiful country, too. In a moment, we're going to get to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. It is called to communion here on EWTN. Do stay with us. It's called to communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're watching us on EWTN television today, you can participate by shooting us an email, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Want to get to a question here from Carisi watching us on Facebook. Carisi says, why do Seventh-day Adventists say that Catholics worship idols and attack Catholics for worshiping idols?
Yeah, thank you. So this criticism is not unique to Seventh-day Adventists. It's actually very ancient in the church. There have always been detractors against the church's practice of venerating icons and images. And of course, within Protestantism, this critique was found in the very beginning, not among all Protestants, but among a very large portion of them, especially the Reformed tradition that emerged out of Switzerland, Zurich, and Geneva in particular, and then the Protestantism as it's practiced in the Anglo-American context is very heavily influenced by Calvinism. So that antipathy towards Catholic veneration of saints and of icons and images is deeply woven into the whole fabric of Protestantism. So the origins of this are interesting. The Ten Commandments say that you should not make graven images and bow down to them and worship them. And as Catholics number the commandments, that is adjoined to the first commandment. Don't have other gods before Yahweh, and don't make images of those gods, and don't bow down and worship them. So the whole thing is a condemnation of idolatry. And of course, Catholics abhor idolatry, and we would avoid idolatry at all costs. And many Catholics have gone to their death by martyrdom rather than engage in idolatry. But it cannot mean what the Calvinists think it means. Now, see, what the Calvinists did, and the Zwinglians as well, is they considered the prohibition against images to be a sort of standalone commandment. They will number it as the second commandment. And well, Catholics don't number the commandments that way. And say, well, this is just a prohibition, just a plain prohibition against any use of sacred art or imagery in worship. And so Ulrich Zwingli, the Zurich reformer, whitewashed the church in Zurich, took all artwork out of the church, even took organs out of the church and church music. And so it kind of became a staple of Calvinist or Reformed worship to worship in a bare, whitewashed room with no ornamentation at all, and sometimes even no instrumentation. And they wouldn't even allow for the composing of hymns. The only singing that was allowed were metrical settings of the Psalms, so biblical texts. And there was a principle that emerged in the Reformed Church called the regulative principle of worship, which said that you can't do anything in sacred worship that you can't warrant directly from the pages of the Bible. That was the position, right? And they took that to mean that you couldn't have any graven images. Well, you could have any images of any kind in sacred worship. Now, it always struck me as odd, because if you will read God's commandments to Moses about the construction of the tabernacle and later the temple, you'll find that he commanded the protection of images, and lots of them, many of them. Israelite worship was not devoid of images. And so, in fact, the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest item, the holiest artifact in Hebrew religion, had angels on the lid, on the cover. And you had images of angels and of pomegranates and all kinds of beasts of the earth and so forth adorning the space of sacred worship in Israel. So the Bible not only fails to condemn, it in fact commands the use of sacred artwork in worship. So where did Zwingli get this idea from? How did he arrive at this interpretation of the Bible? So personal opinion, and not just mine, it's also a scholarly opinion from people who studied Zwingli. Many people think that Zwingli was heavily influenced by a particular school of Renaissance Platonism, a philosophical school that had a deep antipathy towards the body and things physical, and that his conception of religious life was overly intellectualized, and that his philosophical predilections bled into his biblical interpretation and colored it so that he found in sacred scripture things that other people in the Catholic Church fail to find there. If you want a good book that explores that thesis, it's by Carlos Eire, E-I-R-E. The title of the book is The War Against Idols, and it's about this polemical position on the destruction of images in Reformed worship. Now, I think the Seventh-day Adventist impulse is just born out of that same historical stream.
Okay, very good. Carisi, thank you so much for checking us out on Facebook. It's called a Communion here on EWTN with Dr. David Anders. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin here with Steve in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, listening on his Alexa device. Hey there, Steve. What's on your mind today?
Hey, good afternoon. Hey, I really appreciate your show, guys.
Thank you.
So I had a question for Dr. David Anders. He had mentioned, I think it was last week, that he was very skeptical of claims of, finding saint relics in the Middle Ages. And I know Dr. David Anders is a great admirer of St. Augustine, and I was curious because I think the bones of St. Stephen, or the grave of St. Stephen, was found in 415 or sometime around that time. St. Augustine had a lot to write about that. I think it was the City of God or something. I don't know all the details. But I was curious to get Dr. David Anders' thoughts on that. And of course, St. Augustine really isn't anyone's fool, so I'm sure, I think he was convinced those relics were genuine. So I was just curious to get Dr. David Anders' thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I really appreciate the question. So to be clear, I'm a huge fan of relics. And of course, I affirm the Catholic dogma on the suitability of venerating the relics of the saints. And in fact, I have saints' relics in my home that I venerate. And occasionally I'm blessed to visit a fellow Catholic who's sort of replete with relics, in their house. Or we have a monastery in our diocese that's a very old monastery. It has a very nice reliquary that's open to the public, and I really, really, really I appreciate very much to be able to venerate the relics of so many different saints. And I will take for granted, I will presume the legitimacy of any relic that has, a stamp of approval from the church and is in a reliquary and has been blessed and so forth. And I'll go from that. And so if somebody comes to me and they say, I have a relic of Mary Magdalene or whatever, I'm not going to fail to venerate it, right? I'm going to venerate the relic. Now, that being said, I'm keenly aware that there was a traffic in relics in the Middle Ages that became quite excessive. Okay. And it's something that Catholic commentators from the era remark on. People like Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was a great satirist, a devout Catholic, but he had an eye for the satirical, and he knew how to make fun of foolishness when he saw it. Got endless fun out of sort of ribbing people for their credulity. And you've probably heard me tell the story about the medieval relic salesman who shows up in town and offers to hawk the head of John the Baptist. And the townspeople are not such fools. They say, we've already got the head of John the Baptist. And his response is, no, this is the head of John the Baptist as a child. And the fact of the matter is there were multiple competing claims to possessing the very same relic by different parties. So they're clearly spurious relics in circulation in the Middle Ages and probably today as well. And my skepticism is simply that the older the claim and the more noble and august the saint being claimed, the higher the likelihood that it's probably spurious, right, and not genuine. You get into modern saints. If you have a cult, a shrine to a saint that's well attested from antiquity and has sort of been a sort of uninterrupted tradition of veneration of a particular cemetery, for example, where that saint was known to have been buried, that seems a little bit more credible to me. Sure. And also the modern saints, the church takes great care now with the care of bodies of the dead, and someone is in the beatification process, they'll exhume the body and this sort of thing. So much more certainty about that. Sure. Now, how to handle St. Augustine's taking at face value a claim of having discovered the relics of some saint in his own day? Well, of course, I wasn't there, and I don't have the tools to discern, and I'm not going to be able to do a DNA test against the original because we don't have the original, so there's no way for me to assess the validity of the claim. Augustine was nobody's fool, as you rightly hold, and I believe that. He also lived long before the fully developed tradition of sort of critical historical consciousness that we have today. Now, he was no mean historian. I mean, City of God is a deep philosophical engagement with history and the philosophy of history. But he probably was more prone than I would be to naively accept the judgment of a local Catholic community. Does that in any way impugn Augustine as a source of wisdom for Catholic living and Catholic thinking, Catholic theology and philosophy? By no means. Philosophy proceeds from generalities, not from specifics. It looks at what are those elements of human experience that are universal and tries to derive universal principles with universal import. That's the way philosophy works. And Augustine had a philosophical mind second to none, but he's also a man of his times. Sure. But if you present me with a relic of St. Augustine, I'm venerating all day long. There you go. Steve, thanks so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Or if you're watching us today on TV, shoot us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. It is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Let's go now to Kathy in South Bend, Indiana, listening on the Great Redeemer Radio. Hello, Kathy. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
Just wanted to say, well, I'm a creative Catholic. We've raised our 3 children Catholic. My son is a young adult. He's 22. Questioning things. Here's something interesting he said the other day. I'd never heard of this author before, Benny Shannon. So my son said, and I'm kind of embarrassed to ask this, or I just kind of want your opinion and maybe what I can say to my son, but he said, I think he'd read a book and also saw a podcast by Benny Shannon. So he claims that the ancient Israelites and Moses were on hallucinogens when Moses went up Mount Sinai, and that's why Moses thought he saw God and the 10 Commandments and the whole thing. I guess because the acacia tree, the bark of the acacia tree, has dimethyltryptamine in it, and that this author, Benny Shannon, feels like the ancient Israelites were consuming the bark, and they were all on hallucinogens when this whole episode of Moses happened. So I do believe my son is bordering on being an agnostic. So if there's maybe another book or resource maybe I could suggest for him besides this person, Benny Shannon, and his outlandish claims. But I wasn't sure what to say to him. I was like, I'm sorry, I've never heard of him. And I really don't think
sure.
Moses
I think I can help. I appreciate the question. So there is no doubt that people take mind-altering drugs and have overwhelming and overpowering experiences to which they assign a spiritual significance. I mean, we had a hippie movement in the 60s and 70s that was largely fueled by just this kind of thinking. Mm-hmm. And, many of those people permanently damaged their rationality and IQs in consequence, which is a great shame. But they were seeking transcendent experience, and they settled, for garden variety intoxication, really is what it boils down to in many cases. Now, that being said, lots of things can create mind-altering situations for people. You can get a runner's high. You can become deeply engrossed in your work or in music, and you can have a feeling of sort of losing touch with yourself and being sort of immersed in some activity that you find overwhelmingly meaningful or pleasurable or significant, and make you sort of forget your nattering self-conscious narcissism for a little while, and that can appear to give you a sort of sense of liberation, and you can want more of that sense. Mm-hmm. That we recognize that. Now, I think it's one of the reasons, and this is a benevolent form, music can do that for people with less harm than psychedelics. Why is music so often associated with religious practice? I think that's why. I mean, and this is even within a Christian context. People can engage in the practice of music, and they have kind of a sense of being drawn out of themselves into something beautiful and maybe not transcendent in a metaphysical sense, but it transcends them, and it binds them to the people around them in a way where they're all sort of sharing a common experience, that's beyond words. I mean, that's what music does, and it's quite beautiful. And it's from a Catholic point of view, it's right and appropriate that anything that's harmless, in itself, it's not malevolent or dangerous, and drugs, of course, are tremendously dangerous, but something like music or sort of losing myself in my work or collective activities of one kind or another that can give me that sense of belonging to a greater whole and to meaning, these things should be incorporated into our religious lives because we are embodied creatures. We're not Gnostics that think the religious life is merely at the level of the imagined or the conceptual, but it involves our total person and all our affectivity and our will and our emotions and all of those capacities of the human person to self-transcend. We ought to bring all that to the service of the love of God and neighbor. Now, the Catholic insight, I think, that's quite profound and quite important is that the true spiritual experience, the true kind of self-transcendence to which we ought to aim is an ethical self-transcendence where those things are put in the service of the greater or the common good. In my younger days, I used to visit rock concerts, and sometimes there were people who considered themselves quite spiritually enlightened, if you follow my thinking.
Oh, yeah.
And I found them more or less generally to be tremendously selfish and sensual people who used the language of spirituality to justify a lot of self-indulgence, and they really wouldn't be able to rationally pursue the common good. So I think one of the ultimate signs of self-transcendence in a genuinely spiritual way would be an activity like forgiveness. Yes. Or when a person moves from being an arrogant so-and-so to a humble man. Now we're talking about self-transcendence that really, really matters. And so there's a tremendous literature on this in the Catholic tradition. The Catholic spiritual tradition, the likes of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, St. Augustine, who we were discussing earlier, his Confessions, all tremendous books about transcendence and spiritual experience, which has zero to do with psychedelic drug use. Now, the claim that Moses was tripping on top of Mount Sinai is just simply not verifiable.
Yeah.
It's not verifiable at all. I mean, this is just speculation by someone who wants to make hay.
All right. Kathy, thanks so much for your call. In a moment, we're going to go to Max in Houston, also John in Florida. There's a line with your name on it right now at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Do stay with us. Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Or if you're watching today on TV, shoot us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. Would love to hear from you. Let's go to Max now in Houston, listening on the EWTN app, a free download. Hey there, Max. What's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, sir. I had a question here. The way I understand it, Mary is full of grace and could have sinned, but her grace-filled will didn't let her. Why then did Adam and Eve, if they were made perfect, sin? Were they not full of grace, or did Mary have some kind of advantage?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. Mary had a tremendous advantage over Adam and Eve, and it is definitely not the Catholic opinion that she was capable of sin. That is not the Catholic opinion at all. There's no certainty that she was capable of sin, and in fact, a very strongly held opinion among theologians is that she was impeccable, that it was not possible for her to sin. And in view of precisely this dignity of being granted the Immaculate Conception and the fullness, she had grace, the plenitude of grace, as much grace as a human being could ever attain. And more so, right? I mean, it just an unimaginable quantity of grace. Well, it's not something you really quantify, but in view of this tremendous dignity of having been chosen by God to be the mother of God, which is not something that pertains to Eve at all. Eve was chosen to be the mother of the human race, and she was given sufficient grace to fulfill that task worthily. Sufficient grace, not an efficacious grace to preserve her necessarily from every sin, but sufficient grace to be preserved from sin had she chosen to cooperate and to worthily become the mother, the progenitor of the human race. Well, Adam's the progenitor, but Mary was given sufficient grace to be the mother of God worthily. Now, think about the respective positions, between being a good human mom of a human person and being a mom who can worthily bear and parent God.
No comparison?
No comparison.
Okay. Appreciate that, Max. Thank you so much for your call today. Let's go now to John on Palm Coast, Florida, on the coast right there. He's watching us on EWTN television. John, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yes. Hi, David.
Howdy.
How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. How about you?
Okay, great. Listen, I'm a lifelong Catholic, and I'm a senior citizen, so I've always wondered where and how did our Mass originate?
What a wonderful question.
It is.
I really appreciate the question. So we can read about the origin of the Mass in a number of places. Probably my favorite account of the origin of the Mass comes from the 22nd chapter of the Gospel of Luke on Holy Thursday in the upper room when Jesus Christ took bread and said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in memory of me." And then after the supper, he took the cup and said, "This is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Christ instituted the holy sacrifice of the Mass and ordained the apostles as priests in the upper room on Holy Thursday. And St. Paul, who is the earliest New Testament writer, he's writing before the Gospel of Luke was written, in his first letter to the Corinthians, gives a very similar account of the origin of the Mass, and he specifically notes that he had this by way of sacred tradition, that it was handed on to him as it had been received from others, and so he was conscious of receiving a tradition that went back to the earliest days of Christ's institution, even though Paul lived just a few decades later, and yet the celebration of the Mass as a ritual was already being handed down by way of sacred and apostolic oral tradition. Now, over time, as Christianity spread throughout the world, embellishments grew up around the Mass, and those embellishments differed depending on the culture where Christianity was translated. And as Christianity became embedded in a Latin-speaking culture, those embellishments grew into what we now call the Latin Rite. And so most Catholics in the Western world belong to the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church, and our liturgy derives out of that particular cultural heritage. There are other rites in the Catholic Church. Some of them Greek, for example, some Syriac, some Coptic, some Assyrian or Chaldean. And in many respects, they're similar, In some respects, they are different. The Assyrians are particularly different from the rest of the Catholic world in the formulation of their rite, but they all have this one core thing in common, the use of bread and wine consecrated by a priest to become the body and blood of Christ given for us and offered to God in sacrifice.
All right. And John, thank you so much for your call. Hope that's helpful for you there on Palm Coast, Florida. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you call right now, we can probably get you on today's program. Let's go now to Michael in Washington. And Michael's got a great question. What would that be, Michael?
The question is, what is the Catholic response to a Protestant who makes the inquiry, have you been saved?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the question. I love to be asked this question by Protestants, and I answer different ways depending on my mood.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
But I think the best thing to do would be to say, what do you mean by the word? What do you mean by the word? Because if I say yes, he will misunderstand me. And if I say no, he will misunderstand me, because we don't mean the same thing by the word. What many Protestants mean is they imagine that there is a specific moment in time in a person's life when they can be certain of having passed from a tradition of, having passed from a condition of being alienated from God to a position of being reconciled to God in such a way that they now know with certainty and with no exception that they will go to heaven when they die. And so when they ask you the question, are you saved? What they mean is, did you have this moment in time when you passed from alienation or disinterest or rebellion against God to reconciliation with God such that you now know with certainty that you will go to heaven when you die? That's what they mean when they ask the question, are you saved? Now, I think it is a false question, because I do not think that there is any such legitimate experience. I know that there are people who claim to have had such an experience. I say that they are deceiving themselves, because sacred scripture and sacred tradition and reason all tell us that it is impossible for an individual to know right now in historical time with certainty that they will necessarily be reconciled to God for all eternity. Now, the entirety of the biblical tradition stands against that conviction. All of the New Testament is filled with admonitions to stay the course, to persevere to the end, and indicates numerous opportunities, real certainties, in fact, that people who begin the life of grace in Christ can and do depart from it, never to return. So 2 Peter, for example, the epistle of 2 Peter says explicitly, it is better never to have entered the way of righteousness than to set foot on it and then turn back. The book of Hebrews says precisely the same thing. St. Paul, when he wrote the letter to the Galatians, addressed people who he said, you have been born again, you have the Spirit, you have been clothed with Christ, and you are in danger of going to hell because you're stepping away from your first love. You're turning off onto another path. You started right, now you're wrong. All right? So the New Testament position does not allow for this language of have you been definitively, determinately, permanently saved. It doesn't permit for that. And even reason, apart from revelation, reveals to us many people who begin religious life with fervor and all the signs, internal and external, of genuineness and of growth in virtue, and then who fall away and wreck their lives and die without faith. And it takes only a very obstinate and ideological, I think, and very narrow perspective to try to make of such people, they weren't really saved to begin with, or some kind of justification like that.
Yeah.
And what boils down to is if that's the position you take, well, all those who fall away weren't really saved to begin with, then it just goes to my point that you can't have certainty.
Right.
Because those people had every internal, external, subjective, objective indication that they were doing what the other people who claimed to be saved were doing, and yet they still fell away. It leads to the paradox that a former Presbyterian acquaintance of mine articulated. He says, well, you know, the saved know for sure they're going to heaven, and I might be one of them. Well, the problem is they don't know for sure they're going to heaven.
Right.
Jesus' admonition in Matthew 24 was, whoever perseveres to the end will be saved. So here's my position. Here's my position when someone asks me this question. How do I understand subjectively my religious life? I have encountered Jesus Christ in the Bible, and in the Catholic Church, and in sacred tradition, and in the persons of his saints, and in holy men and women that I have known. That's how I have encountered him. I am captivated by the person of Christ, and I would like my life to be lived in imitation of Jesus' life. And I'm doing a fairly poor job of it now, thank you very much. But I do have confession, and I have the sacraments to keep me on track. So I will make every effort to persevere to the end, to grow in virtue and holiness, and to conform myself to Jesus, because that's the path of life that he has set out for me, and it is a good path of life. It's a path that leads to rationality, to self-control, to resilience, to virtue, and to simple human goodness. And so I'm going to walk that path as hard as I can, as long as I can. But I trust not in my own strength, because I know that I could get off that path at any minute. I could stumble in grievous ways. Many people have done so. And may God preserve me until the end.
Absolutely. All right, Michael, thank you. And that really was a great question. Appreciate hearing from you today in Washington. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. I want to remind you to join us for a stalwart of Catholic radio, and that would be Catholic Answers Live. Now on the air for almost, I think 25 years or so. Check it out on EWTN Radio, 6 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. And of course, EWTN Radio is the exclusive radio home for Catholic Answers Live. It's a wonderful, wonderful program. Answers an awful lot of questions, just like we try to do here Monday through Friday on Call to Communion. Let's go right now to Mary. Mary is listening in Michigan on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Mary, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. I have a question about valid baptism. My children were affected by the technicality of the priest saying, we baptize you instead of I baptize you, and so the baptism and all subsequent sacraments were not valid, and it really put a strain. But anyway, I've grown in my faith, and I've grown from being a kid thinking Jesus is doing a check mark that you went to Mass and all that kind of thing. And I know it's more about a relationship. So I just want to understand why the Church would take this position that seems like a technicality, like a check mark.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So let me draw a distinction that might help you. And I was having a conversation once with a canonist friend of mine about impediments for validity in marriage. So it's not the sacrament of baptism. It's a different sacrament.
Right.
But this is an area where what might appear to some people to be technicalities occupy the vast majority of judicial rulings in the day-to-day life of the church courts. It's regulation of marriage is kind of that's the bread and butter of your typical canonist, right? That's where they spend all their time. And I was a little bit worried, on an analogous question, namely, a lot of people running around in invalid marriages, or what would probably be found to be invalid marriages if they were subjected to scrutiny, and they don't know about it. And I was expressing some concern for perhaps the spiritual state of these individuals, and whether the Church had a sort of a duty of obligation to be more diligent about getting the word out or whatnot. And the canonist made an interesting and I think pertinent observation. She said to me, well, remember that the job of a canonist is to determine validity, but we leave grace up to God. Right? And we always recognize that God himself is not bound by the sacramental form.
That's true.
God, and clearly in sacred history, there are bountiful examples of God extending grace to people through some medium other than the sacraments. Basically, everybody before the coming of Christ who was a saint, who was a holy person, experienced God's grace, participated in God's grace in some extra sacramental form. and some of them even outside the household of Israel. All the characters in Genesis 1 to 11 that were identified as men and women of God who walked with God, some of them even translated to heaven, like Enoch, did so without the benefit of the Christian sacraments. Righteous Job, a man in whom there was no fault, somebody else that wasn't even an Israelite. So we recognize that God can extend grace to people in ways known only to himself, and God is certainly not going to penalize an individual. Oh, well, I wanted to let you in heaven, but gosh, that priest said we. God's not going to do that, and we know that. Okay. That's not how God functions, okay? But does it matter that we have principles to define a valid sacrament? Well, of course it does, and here's why. The sacraments are for our benefit, all right? They're not for God's benefit. He doesn't need them, we do. And Christ instituted them, and they have a determinate form and content because, well, two reasons. What is a sacrament? Well, it's an efficacious sign, a sign that actually accomplishes what is signified. It's an efficacious sign instituted by Christ by which divine life is transmitted, given to us. That's the Church's definition. Now, look at both sides of that definition. It's efficacious. It intrinsically contains the grace that's signified, and it signifies. Now, the Catechism also teaches, because they signify, because they are signs, the sacraments also teach. So what are you teaching? The whole counsel of God, I hope. And there are times when people want to monkey with the words of the sacraments because they have some, say, ideological motive. For example, let me take another sacrament. Let's take, it's the same sacrament but different problem. When people want to baptize in the name of the Creator and the Redeemer and the Sanctifier, rather than the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, why are people motivated to do this? Generally, these days, is because of a sort of misplaced concern for gender equity. They don't like to use gendered terms like Father and Son in reference to God, and so they'll improve on the baptismal formula, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that do any harm to anybody? Well, clearly, first of all, at the level of teaching, certainly it does, all right? Because Father and Son, as applied to the Godhead, are not terms about sexual differentiation. And the person who takes them that way misunderstands the nature of Trinitarian language. Father and Son don't describe biological relations within the Trinity, but relations of persons to whom Son and Father are the best human analogs, right? Namely, begetting and filiation, right, is the way the distinction works. And that tells me something about the inner life of God, the inner communion of persons in the Godhead, to which my life should become conformed. Now, if I use instead the language of Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier, it makes it sound like God is just differentiating roles.
Yes.
And there's an ancient heresy called Sabellianism or Modalism that teaches that three persons of the Trinity really aren't three persons at all. They're just different functions. Like God's a postman on Mondays and he's a fireman on Tuesdays, and he's a pop star on Thursdays. And one day he's a creator, one day he's a redeemer. And that tells you nothing, however, that sort of imagery tells you nothing about the inner life of Trinitarian communion. And so out of a misplaced desire for, say, gender equity, they actually mangle the Catholic doctrine on God. So it fails to teach what we need to know to really develop our inner lives. So that's one reason why the proper formula is important. It's also important for the efficacious part, for the inner life of for the power of the sacrament, because we need to have certainty about if a sacrament has been validly performed so that we can have certainty about the offer of grace. So, see, take a sacrament like confession. One of the great things about confession is that when I go to confession, I don't have to guess. I know that God has offered me the grace of forgiveness. Now, the form of the sacrament reflects the reality. The words, I absolve you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, reflect the reality that absolution genuinely is offered to me by God. The sign conforms to the reality. By having rules about validity, if I go to confession, I am not left in doubt. I, the recipient, know with certainty that I have been absolved. Now, do priests ever mangle the words of the absolution? It has happened. It has happened. Some priests, again, out of a kind of misplaced concern for equity and sort of democracy, will prescind from saying, I absolve you, and they'll say, well, God forgives you. Not the same thing. No. Not the same thing. Well, I know God forgives me. In a general way, what I want is certainty that he has extended forgiveness to me, not in some general way, but right here and now, through the medium of this sacrament. And the language, the specification of the words, not only conforms to the reality, but also gives me a objective basis to know with certainty that I have been absolved. And so it is an act of mercy on the church's part not to let any priest do willy-nilly whatever he wants, but to specify, you must say these words. Now, what do we do when somebody has messed it up and we're the church, or you're a bishop?
Yeah. And
you find out you've had a priest who's been out in left field for 30 years and has mishandled people, has been sort of pastoral ineptitude or maybe malice. I don't know what the motive is, right? What do you do in that circumstance? You proceed with kid gloves, in my judgment. You treat those people with such kindness and sensitivity. You do not send them a bureaucratic letter in the mail ordering them to show up, next Thursday at 11:59 a.m. for their baptism. No, no, no. You go to them and you accompany them and you apologize and you make it good to them.
Sure.
But you still insist on the form.
Okay. Mary, is that helpful for you?
I appreciate that so much. Thank you. And I guess that's part of what I'm struggling with, too, because one of the ones that just got a letter and said, you need to fix it. And it's just alienating as a lifelong Catholic.
Very.
I feel like you're walking alone.
Sure.
Very alienating. And I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
And if this happened to me, I'd be mad as a snake.
Yeah.
I'd be like, you don't deserve this. You don't. You deserve the sacraments, validly performed and charitably performed.
I like your phrase of kid gloves.
Yep.
Just give them that respect. Appreciate your call. Thank you so much, Mary. Here's a quick one now from Bradley watching on Facebook. What should we believe about the writings of Anne Catherine Emmerich? What level of trust should we give them? I've ran into some folks who put more faith in writings such as these and study them more often than they do the Bible or the Catechism. All right, Anne Catherine Emmerich. What do we believe there?
Yes. So Anne Catherine Emmerich and other people who claim the status of visionary. Right? When someone in the church says that some sacred person, a saint, or Jesus or the Blessed Virgin Mary has appeared to them and revealed some information to them, how seriously should we take those claims? We should certainly not take any such claim with the level of seriousness or devotion that is due to sacred scripture or sacred tradition. Certainly not. Because these fall under the category of what the church calls private revelation. Private revelation. Now, when Christ commanded the apostles to go into all nations, make disciples, and teach everything he had commanded them, that is the church's public revelation. Those things that were taught by Christ or that are immediately entailed by them, developments from them as human reason and the tradition of the church has explored and tried to penetrate the depths of Christ's teaching and make it applicable in a kind of universal way, right? All of that is the public teaching of the church. That's what we are to hand on when we make disciples. That's what we need for salvation. St. Peter says that in the promises of Christ we have all we need, emphasis, all we need for life and godliness. That's what St. Peter says. Okay. All we need for life and godliness from the public teaching of the church. Because it's about such things as the life of virtue and growing in grace and repentance from sin and holiness and asceticism and renouncing evil and that kind of business. It's the general contours of the spiritual life. You can apply it in your own concrete circumstance in your own way, but that's the general teaching of the church. Now, what these visionaries claim is to have had specific information that may or may not be applicable to a specific individual. Or to a specific set of individuals. So if somebody comes to you and says, well, God has told me that you're supposed to marry my niece, right? That would be a classic example of someone claiming private revelation for a specific purpose. And your answer to that question will be, well, he hasn't told me yet, right? Can God speak to people through private revelation? Of course he can. He's God.
Sure.
Do whatever he wants.
Sure.
Are there many spurious claims to private revelation? All day long and twice on Sundays.
You bet.
Right? Every once in a while, and just because somebody's a saint doesn't mean their private revelations are veridical or true either. Right? Every once in a while, the church will sort of nod the head to a visionary and say this is maybe a little bit more worthy of consideration, but never at the level of public revelation.
Very good. Bradley, thanks for your question via Facebook. And Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Remember that we do this program on EWTN Radio Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time right here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. God bless.